presentation we have planned for you. The floor
Great.
is yours, my friend.
Thank you.
Of course.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here at the University of Delaware. As we drove up, I had forgotten Recitation Hall was here, but one of my first classes when I was at the University of Delaware was an art appreciation course at Old College. So it brings back really great memories. I really enjoyed my time here. And I actually lived in Seifert Hall, so I don't know if it still has the reputation it had back then, but it was a pretty wild place to live in your first year in college, but I survived it. So tonight I want to talk about artificial intelligence, anti-money laundering, compliance, and what does that mean for the future of money? Now, a lot of people say, what does any of those things have to do with one another? But I thought we'll tie it in at the very end about this is an area that I've grown to really love and one that I spent most of my career doing. So I think there's great opportunities if you're looking for a career. When I first started at the University of Delaware, I majored in accounting. And I took my first accounting course and I said, I don't think this is for me. So I changed my major immediately to marketing, and the rest is history. But so let me just give you a little bit of background. Let's start with a few questions. Artificial intelligence, what is it? Does anybody know?
To be honest, I've only heard a lot of news clippings about it recently and didn't really look into it that much farther.
Okay.
Yeah, I think robots, like, technology kind of thinking.
That's exactly right. So most of it's equated to robots and how they're going to take over the world. So a lot of the jobs we have today we won't have because of these things, but we'll have people who have to make the robots, program the robots, and repair the robots, right? So there is opportunity, but it is going to be the wave of the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically in a few minutes about what it means for money laundering and how it can be used to really do a much better job. So let me give you a little history about my background and how I got into compliance. So I took my first real job. After law school, I sold real estate for a couple of years. And I really loved it, but an internship program opened up at the Wilmington Trust Company. And I went through that, and there was no job at the end of it. And all the interns had been placed, and I was sitting in this room all by myself and wondering what I was going to do with my life, because they don't place you, you have to find a job. And so I went on the posting board and I saw a listing for the compliance officer. I thought, well, that sounds interesting. It's in the legal department. I had a law degree, so maybe I had a shot at it. So I applied and I got the job. And the guy who was in the job had been with the bank for 40 years and knew the formation of all the regulations. And when I started, I was the only compliance officer for the whole bank, if you can imagine, even back then, in 1987. And I fell in love with compliance. It's a fascinating field. All banks, as you know, as most industries are highly regulated. And when I thought back then about how I could really be of service, it kind of led me to where I am today. Because the laws that Congress pass are usually passed by legislators who've never had any private experience. And I thought then, as I still think today, that most of the legislators really don't understand how the banking system works, yet they pass these onerous, burdensome laws that don't work. And if you remember, in 1987 was kind of ironic because it was the time of the savings and loan crisis. Fast forward to 2008, and we had another similar kind of housing crisis because of laws the Congress passed that didn't work to help solve the problems. So that's why I really got interested in compliance. So fast forward to the last part of my career at PayPal. I actually was brought on by my former boss from American Express to help build PayPal's compliance program in 2011. So PayPal started in 1999, as most of you probably know, but it had a weak, if not nascent, compliance program for a long time. And they, moved along and it continued to grow. And when I started, we had about 12 people in compliance and policy. And they had no written policies or procedures, if you can believe it. And this is how banks get into trouble. Have you seen the recent news about Wells Fargo? They've gotten in trouble again. I scratch my head because a bank that large with that many people, and they probably have thousands of people doing compliance, how they could miss the things that they've missed. And I have a whole other theory on how we can fix the compliance field, but I'm not going to go into that because that's not the topic of tonight's conversation. So anyway, at PayPal, the first task I had was to build a compliance program to thwart off money laundering and terrorist financing. And for those of you who don't know, PayPal at the time then had about 100 million customers. We were in 203 jurisdictions. and we process tens of millions of transactions a day. So before I go into the details, let me just tell you what a compliance program like that looks like. So when you start in compliance, the first thing you're supposed to do under the regulations is do a risk assessment. So you have to risk assess your products and your geography and the delivery services for those products. Now PayPal is very unique because it's an online technology company as opposed to a bank. So a lot of the laws that were created for money laundering in particular were not created for a business that you never saw your customers. So it made it hard for us to comply to begin with. But before I go any further, the next topic I'm going to move into is anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. What's money laundering? Any idea? Yep.
I actually just did a presentation on it in
Oh.
COM 212. It's the process of pretty much taking dirty money gained from illicit means and putting it through a process, three-step process, and turning it or making it look like it's legal money.
Okay, so since you know so much, what are the 3 steps of the process?
Placement, integration, and last one's escaping me.
No, it's good. That's great because it's placement into the system. Then there's layering, and then it's integration. So it masks the true thing of the money. So the law was actually passed it's the Bank Secrecy Act, by the way. It was passed in 1970. And the banks kind of fumbled around. So it was before I was in banking, but the banks kind of fumbled around until about 1980 when the regulators started catching up and started cracking down. But literally, organized crime would make a friend at the bank, and they would come, especially in the banks in Florida, to the bank with wheelbarrows full of cash to launder. And it was that simple. They would literally, and I'm not making this up, they would actually come to the bank with a wheelbarrow full of cash. Oh, this is from my dry cleaning, or from my pizza shop, or from my, all the cash businesses like laundromats. And yet, of course, it wasn't. It was from organized crime. So most of it's related to drug money and drug sales. And so there's a whole process around that. And so it really, the laws evolved over time, and then they became much more complex in terms of how you had to comply. So the original part of the law, the requirements were to do reporting. So there were things like the currency transaction report. So if you go into a bank and you bring more than $10,000 in cash, you had to fill out a government form. Well, the criminals were smart enough to know that, if you bring in $10,000 of cash, they're going to make me fill out that form. So they would do things what they call structuring. So they would try to hide the pattern. So it was placement, and then the layering is the hiding of the money, and then integration is so that now can be used to look like legitimate proceeds. And that's really the game that the banks and payment companies are required to really fight against. The other form that you're required to file, and it wasn't really used that much in the beginning, but I'll get to the transaction monitoring part, which is where we'll talk about the artificial intelligence piece of this, but is a suspicious activity report. So if a bank or a payment company sees a transaction that flows through their systems that looks unusual or suspicious based on certain parameters, they're required to file another form with the government. Now those are secret. You're not allowed to tell the customer that you're filing them, and actually you can be criminally prosecuted if you do tell the customer. So those are supposed to be kept from the would-be criminals. At PayPal, we filed when I left in 2016. We were filing somewhere north of 80,000 a year. Which is a tremendous amount of staff to do that kind of transaction money. But we process tens of millions of transactions a day, so ergo, you would find a lot of things that looked unusual or suspicious. The other forms, and they kind of developed over time, were the monetary instrument log. So they also found out over time